Welcome to the Get Real About Safety podcast. In our podcast, we discuss the new view of safety, what works and what doesn't work, to break down old paradigms and help you improve safety performance in your organization. Hi, I'm Mike.
And I'm Pam, and we appreciate you listening. Please share and subscribe and tell others about this podcast. You can find us on most podcast platforms and also on YouTube. Well, good morning, and thanks for joining us. I am grateful to have three of my favorite safety people, I should just say favorite people, back to the podcast to give us an update, second update on the COVID-19 virus pandemic. And you are all doing some really great things to protect our workers, and it's my pleasure to have you back. I'd like to go ahead and do a quick introduction. Most people probably know you, but Hilarie, do you want to start who you are and what you do?
Sure. All right. Well, I'm Hilarie Warren. Glad to be with you. I'm an industrial hygienist with the state of Georgia's on-site safety and health consultation program, where I've been for, this is my 16th year with that program.
Wow.
And I have an undergrad in biology and a master's degree in public health. And so this is an interesting topic for me. And back in 2009, 2010, our program was the recipient of an OSHA Susan Harwood grant on developing business continuity plans for businesses in the face of, what if we have a pandemic? And that was brought to fruition during that time period. And we went from talking about it in the abstract to talking about it in real time as the swine flu H5N1 pandemic occurred during that time period. So developed a lot of training materials around management of an infectious disease in the workplace during that time.
So you were ready for this?
Yeah, we were ready for this. And honestly kind of dismayed just personally, but certainly was expected to. We have short memories as human beings, I think. And so, we went from, oh, well, maybe this will happen at some point in time, and trying to convince people that they don't want to prepare for it in the middle of it. And then witnessed people scrambling, and we worked, nonstop with companies during that period of time. And it wasn't that long ago, 10 years. And I think the thing that's been shocking is just to watch the denial around this in comparison to people working hard to do the best that they could during that particular pandemic. So, yeah.
Thank you, Hilarie. Lisa.
Well, good morning. My name is Lisa Capacik. I work with Brasfield and Gorrie. We are a large general contractor based in the Southeast. I am part of the group of 80 or so safety professionals that we have. And a lot of my work in the field with project kind of revolves around implementing a lot of the best practices, a lot of the, in this particular case, helping our crews and groups understand the importance of kind of an ever-evolving set of guidelines and rules that we practice out in the field, which to Hilarie's point, makes it difficult because we're learning new things every day and every week about COVID-19 and how it's transmitted and some of the best practices. It makes it harder for people to really set their sights on one goal. And so the more information changes, the more people have opportunities to maybe doubt its validity, and just really kind of figuring out ways to work with the team to keep it keep that topic in the forefront and really help our implementation and really resilience out in the field to make it through the life of this pandemic prior to a vaccination being out and about, to all of us. And so I'm excited to talk about that today with everyone. I always learn things on these podcasts. So thank you for having me.
Well, now you're going to just skip right over the fact that you're a CSP and you get a master's in this and that and all this stuff, because you're one of the most humble people I know. But
well, thank you. Yeah, I actually did start out on the IH side and moved over into the safety realm probably about 5 years into my career, but was able to bring some of that knowledge, specifically working in the construction industry and exposures to our employees in everyday tasks. And then partnered with Hilarie and Georgia Tech on efforts and a few other things. So it's been really fun and unique angle to be able to come in and provide just some gap knowledge for tasks that we do every day. I think that oftentimes is maybe overcomplicated and seemingly insurmountable in the construction industry. So, but yeah, I have probably 32 years now, I think, in the industry, and it's been a fun ride for the most part.
for the most part, and that's one of the things that makes this group so interesting, because you all have strong industrial hygiene, health experience married with construction experience, and that's somewhat of a rare thing. And so that's why I'm so grateful to have you all on here. And we'll shift over to Nicole, who has a kind of a similar background.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning. My name is Nicole Ivers. I'm the corporate HSE director for Batson Construction here in the Southeast. I've worked here in the U.S. and then also overseas as well on some large construction projects. Just came back a couple years ago, just in time for this COVID pandemic. But like Lisa and Hilarie, I started in industrial hygiene. I have a master's in industrial hygiene and then a CIH, and I then later got involved in safety and became a CSP. So this is kind of interesting to be able to kind of see the first area of my experience and passion around safety, which is more of a public health focus, to come back and now intertwine with construction safety.
Excellent, thank you. So I want to kick things off here a little bit with Hilarie and let you give the update forecast that you were talking about.
Well, it's changing daily, right? But where we're at today on November 24th, 2 days before Thanksgiving, here in the United States, we're, just sort of a rundown of our statistics I thought might be useful to just come back to is, we're at over 12 million cases, over 263,000 deaths. And, we were getting better, I think, at tracking where we're at with looking at community spread, and we've got a lot of schools back in session now here in Georgia, at least in person. And so looking at what that data has brought to us over the past few weeks, and I think really identifying, at least here, that we're honing in on that schools are not the spreaders that we thought they were going to be necessarily, as long as there are certain protocols in place. We've also seen a big distinction between those that have gone, with universal masking in the schools versus those that left it to be optional. And so the data is really starting to point towards the smaller gatherings of people that are certainly driving community transmission. At the moment, 1 American is dying per minute from COVID. That's our sort of current stat. And the thing that I think it's really important to highlight, and why I said our date and that we're 2 days before Thanksgiving, is that we all have to sort of remember that the lag time that we're looking at in terms of data, because you have to have the incubation period, and then you have to feel, and then once the incubation period passes, right, you might develop symptoms, and then those symptoms take a few days to worsen and then potentially lead you to hospitalization, et cetera. So, the projections are that we're looking at probably 3,000 people a day dying, up from 1,700 people a day dying by, the second week of December, by 12/12.
And what's shocking about that, Hilarie, is that is a 9/11 every day.
Correct.
And those of us remembering the gut wrench of 9/11, and it's happening every day.
Daily. And yet I'm getting invites to Christmas parties, right? So there's, just a reminder, our incubation period, sort of what we know right now is that it's, 2 to 14 days. They're holding fast on that 14 days. Most people are showing symptoms, within the first 4 to 5 days. Certainly the vast majority by 11 days in. If you're going to show symptoms, that's when they're going to show up. And that's, again, sort of really important for us to remember, I think, as we talk later today in the podcast about contact tracing and the role that it plays, is keeping some of these numbers in mind. And so forecast, in addition to I can't even think about 3,000 people a day, we're going to add in seasonal flu as well, as we start moving into the winter months. And that while those numbers are harder to really pin down, because seasonal influenza isn't a notifiable disease, right? It's so any number that you typically generate talking about seasonal influenza, you're gonna have a wide range of where your estimates are going to be, because health departments aren't necessarily going to be notified whether there was a seasonal influenza case. So we know that last year that was somewhere in the range of about 25,000 to 60,000 people died in the US from seasonal influenza, which is a lower number than it was in that 2017-2018 period. Was high, but it's still is not touching where we're at now. And we know that seasonal flu is also gonna sicken millions, and that it will put tens of thousands of people into the hospital. So we've got that as an addition to talking about COVID that I think is important, especially if we're going to talk about preventative measures. So I think that's sort of the basic update. We're testing more people, and that's good, but our test positivity rate is the number now that we're really looking at, right? Mm-hmm. Is that what is the percentage of people that test positive in relationship to the total number of people tested, and that's the number that we're also looking to sort of track at this point as we move into the winter and trying to make educated decisions about what we need to do next in our communities and workplaces.
Would you also touch on you've been involved where I think the rest of us are more focused on the construction side. You're also involved with manufacturing and food processing. You talk on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, the challenge with manufacturing and food processing is that you also have other agencies that are now involved, right? So you have FDA and USDA and OSHA, right, and CDC and all these different folks that are looking at food safety, and what that means, as well as the workers themselves in those places. So there are resources that are specifically designed and co-published really by the FDA and OSHA to address human and animal food operations. And that's sort of one group. And then there are recommendations specific for manufacturing that does not include food. And they're distinct really because you're looking at different sanitation efforts in those facilities oftentimes. But then, you have in some food production, you have people harvesting things in the field, right? And by hand, and their layout and proximity to each other is different than those people that are working on the processing line at a poultry plant, for example. So those are all going to be a little bit different in parameters. We certainly have seen the highest caseload in the meat packing industries when we're talking about food, and that's really a function of how close those folks are standing together. So the number of people that are present at any given time, how close they are in proximity to each other. And oftentimes it's not just that they're shoulder to shoulder, but they're also shoulder to shoulder and directly across from each other. And modifying that is challenging. And then depending on the building structure, oftentimes the food processing facilities, are challenged with their ventilation anyhow. And so there's a number of factors that are at play for the food manufacturing industry, and the facilities are also, it's dependent on sort of occupancy loading at the time. And so there's some really good guidance that's come out for both of them. And in reviewing that, I think there's also some really excellent lessons that construction can take too from those documents, and at least just some of the questions that could be asked and modified for this particular industry group as well.
You mentioned ventilation. I want to remember to come back to that. Before we started recording, we were talking about the issue of perception of risk in safety overall, what a huge issue is. Lisa, you want to pick up on that?
Well, I think dealing with or working with anybody, I think we all, just people being people, have different perceptions of what's risky and what's not, based on, their own work environments, their family environments, their upbringing in that. And I think as safety professionals, I think we work in that environment, really trying to bridge that gap of understanding of risk, and to provide some continuity with really the workforce that we are trying to help. So dealing with risk, and I try to find ways out in the field to help people understand that their risk and their experiences, especially working with COVID, is going to be completely different to the next person. So being able to find folks that you would otherwise not think that they had any experience with COVID, through orientations and through conversations in the field, do you know anybody that's been affected by it? Do you have any family members, or are you aware of anybody within your circle? And oftentimes I've been able to find somebody that has a pretty unique experience, whether it's a family member working in the healthcare industry that contracted COVID and is really struggling now in the aftermath. Their symptoms may not have been as severe requiring intubation, but they are still suffering side effects from it. So I think them seeing it personally and being able to share that personal experience with others, I think helps with the COVID fatigue, to know and understand that it is, yes, it really is here. And now I know somebody on the job that I work with and kind of how it affects. I mean, we still are all suffering from a significant amount of COVID fatigue. And the fact that the information changes, recommendations changes throughout the weeks and months, it just causes doubt to creep in. And I understand it. I mean, it's frustrating to change from what face coverings are okay and what are not. And then what was not is now back to being okay in some cases. But, really, I think as safety professionals, this is a perfect storm for us to really come out of this experience with some additional leadership skills and some credibility, that we might not have otherwise had.
I like your suggestion about having folks share personal experiences, because that does tend to make it more real. One thing we know about how the brain works and perception of risk is that, first of all, humans are terrible in their ability to judge risk. We are just absolutely lousy at it. And what we deal with in safety on a day-to-day basis is the phenomenon that I think we're going through that's leading to fatigue, is that the longer you are exposed to a risk and nothing bad happens to you, the more it changes your perception of that risk not being a real risk. And that's a real problem for us to fight. We'll come back to COVID fatigue here in a little bit. I wanted to, maybe Nicole has this, can pick up on two things. One is the problem we're having with transportation and folks riding in groups to work. Do you want to start with that? Have you had any way to deal with that, or is it just something we can't change?
It is definitely one of the biggest challenges, that and the living setups of a lot of our workforce, just by, culturally, a lot of them live in, groups of at least 4 in an apartment. And that has definitely been making it more difficult when we have somebody who contracts it, and the impact, especially when we have all 4 or 5 of those people are working on the same job site. It's a huge impact on them.
And how do they even quarantine under those circumstances?
Well, that makes it more difficult on the people that are just the roommates. So if one person contracts it, they all have to quarantine basically for the 2 weeks. But once that first person's quarantine, the infected person's quarantine is up, then the remaining 3 start their real quarantine. So to be able to tell these guys that, you're going to be out of work for 4 weeks is almost impossible. So, a lot of these, this is the most protective way to prevent the spread, but without testing, especially, or some means to get people out of those apartments and separate them, we do our best wherever we can to make sure that people aren't traveling together, aren't rooming together. As far as most of our traveling staff, like corporate, we rent separate vehicles wherever possible so that we're not riding in the same vehicles for long distances. But most of this is within our trade partners, and a number of tiers down many times. And what messages we give our immediate trade partners doesn't always make its way down. So it does become very challenging to try and control that. And then just something as simple as lunch, going out to all sit in their vehicles and eat lunch together. So, we've tried on a lot of our job sites to provide eating areas that, have a lot of tables, they're spread out, they're open air, and trying to encourage people to eat there. but but not too close together.
Yeah, we're all dealing with pets, aren't we here? And I don't know that any business, maybe some of you do, that has found a way to deal with specifically the quarantine issue. I've read, in other countries that government's actually even paying for hotels or whatever for folks to have a place where they could afford to go. But I don't know of any of that happening here.
No, I mean, oh, sorry, Lisa.
No, go ahead.
The only sort of additional experience I had was, and I think they're working with an entirely different budget, is the entertainment industry, like the film entertainment industry. And back when, sort of towards the beginning of summer, we had some advisory calls with a production group that, was looking to plan their shoot here in Georgia, and what that needed to look like. They had not yet hired a COVID coordinator. We obviously advised them that that's something that they would want to pursue, and what are some of the tasks that person might look at. But their plan was certainly to basically rent out and make a compound, basically, for those folks that were going to need to be on site, on set for a period of time, and basically hold them there. And so, whether it was renting out a mess load of rooms at the local motel, or bringing in trailers, or mobile homes, and sort of holding people, just much like the pro sports folks are able to do right now, create that bubble, right? And I think we all look at that and look at this industry and say, oh my God, there's no way. But honestly, I think if it's something to just put into the toolbox of thoughts, especially if there was a project that had to get completed, on a time scale that was not going to allow for any flexibility, or if that work was taking place in an area where you knew you had really high community spread, it's just sort of thinking through what are some of these costs that we might start building into projects that we never thought about before, and is that even a feasible option to think about? But again, to Lisa's point, if we're talking about weighing risks, right now you're talking about not just the health risk for somebody, but the risk of not completing the job on time, right? And what is that cost? So it was an interesting approach for the entertainment folks, I think, early on, and one that maybe has worked successfully. And whether that has extendability into other industries, I don't know.
Lisa, did you want to follow up on the Nicole's conversation on transportation?
Well, I think, I mean, she brings up a really good point, from a transportation to, and usually those guys that are coming, or those folks that are coming to the jobs, you have a lot that are riding together or traveling to and from together. And I think where we've tried to, and I know Nicole has done this as well, but there's some of that you cannot stop. But what we can do, and what we've been able to do in some instances, is keep those crews together, not knowing what they're doing, or if they're collectively meeting at a warehouse to come and make some deliveries, or they're actually meeting at another place and coming to the job site. Is just keeping that crew together, that rode together, and they all are working just in that crew by themselves, so that when they leave, or if there is an issue, the terrible thing is it's taking out the crew in its entirety, but it's a much more easy to isolate them, and to isolate any other group that may have been contact, versus having, each of those 3 or 4 or more folks go into different crews. So isolating them that way, we've had some success with that. But you have to know what's going on in the projects, and the leadership on the projects has to be diligent and really kind of observing how people are showing up to work. Not just how they're showing up through the gates, but how are they, where are they parking, watching to see who's getting out of cars or trucks together, how deliveries are coming in. A lot of them will come in through deliveries, but if you have to actually physically be out to see this, to make an accurate assessment of what's going on and what needs to be done.
Yeah, there you go. The age-old problem. You've got to get out of the office and get out in the field. Nicole, I want to bounce back to you. I don't know if you had any follow-up on that, but I was also going to throw at you something that Hilarie had mentioned in our notes, which is, is there anything special that can be done for those of us in any organization that have an increased risk, those with chronic health conditions, obesity, et cetera? Is that something we're able to deal with?
I think that the fact that we just don't know who's going to be hit the hardest. I mean, really, in the beginning, there was a lot of focus on people who are, immune compromised or in a certain age group or high risk. But really what we're seeing now is that, it's really hitting different age groups. It can hit them just as hard. So right now, I think and correct me if I'm wrong, Hilarie, the higher population that's in the hospital right now are actually like in the 40-year-old age group. So we've gone through maybe the focus on the elderly and the nursing homes, and now it is hitting our working, healthy group. So yeah, I think that the solution is just maintaining that diligence, no matter who it is. So you may have somebody that says, hey, I'm 30 years old and it's, I'm healthy. If I get it, it's not a big deal because I'm going to be able to recover. But, we don't know how that's going to impact the others on the job site. So it's really just, taking those precautions equally and trying to maintain that because, like we just talked about, this pandemic fatigue, I almost feel like it's creating a larger gap in, there's this group of people that now are just absolutely animate that it doesn't exist. I mean, absolutely adamant that this is just, a make-believe virus and nobody is dying from it. And there's other people who are absolutely scared, so much more than what they were in the beginning. And they're now seeing their loved ones get it. And I've had, I know people whose entire families have got it, have, had people die, have people in the hospital. So now it seems like it's really affecting so many more people personally, where they actually know somebody, and it is changing their risk perception finally.
It absolutely does change your risk perception. Kind of ironically, just going back to 1918, this is not our first rodeo, right? With the pandemic situation, with any pandemic, in 1918 was such a huge one. And I ask people now, because I'm heavy into family history and genealogy, and I know that 1918 hit my great-grandfather's family so hard, and I know the faces, they're on my wall and portraits of those that died in 1918. So getting it to that personal understanding is what it takes. We've heard this anecdotally with the folks crying, it's a hoax, until they're laying in the ICU and now it's not a hoax, sadly. Hilarie, do you want to touch any more on the problems with our workers that are increased risk?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the thing that's interesting, listening to Nicole and Lisa and you sort of talk about this, and knowing that a lot of it is about perception, and whether that perception is influenced by a story, right? A personal anecdote, or personally knowing somebody, or if it's coming from somewhere else. Just recently, our sitter came to watch Owen, and her parents had just returned from Mexico. She had pleaded with them not to go, but that's what they do for Dia de los Muertos, right? And have every year. And so they said, we're going and we will take all the precautions and it'll be fine. And they've been very careful since they've, went living here. But she just told me that while they were in Mexico, in the town that they visit, the church bells ring. They ring the church bells when someone dies, right, and passes on. And that while they were there, the bells were ringing 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times a day. And that she said her mom came home changed, right? That
Right.
it's one thing for us, to talk about 3,000 people a day and know, right, as Americans who lived through 9/11, like what that number is, how we felt, et cetera. And it's different for different cultures, right?
Right.
And how they might process certain events or things that are in the world, and to, bring it home and realize that they were in a space where every time they heard that bell ring, they realized, wait, this is so abnormal. This is not what, we used to experience. And so when we talked about that, I just thought it was so interesting, and especially for me, and, going back to my public health roots, thinking about how we communicate our messaging, when we're trying to convince people to change a behavior, right, or to understand a risk or to make a modification. It's just been interesting to watch the messaging that's been coming out, around CDC, et cetera, as we build up to Thanksgiving and the holidays, and, really honing in on, you're going to kill grandma if you go, right? Like bluntly, I've watched the messages get blunter and blunter. And again, it's just, we, as safety and health professionals, we're constantly trying to find that balance between how do we demonstrate to people that we can embrace uncertainty, we can acknowledge uncertainty, and still, move forward with measures that we know do work. The other case that has just been presented recently is that one of the art teachers here in Cobb County,
Yes.
he's young. I mean, like Nicole said, he's young, and he's in ICU on a ventilator fighting for his life. He's on life support at this point. And his wife also has just recovered from COVID, and a GoFundMe has been set up. And I logged in last night to make a contribution because our art teacher at our school knows him very well, and she is just beside herself. And there was a comment from a woman on this GoFundMe who was like, I don't really know why we have to have a GoFundMe set up. Isn't COVID covered, right, as an illness, and won't it all be paid for? And the discussion that lit up within that one comment was just really interesting to peruse. And, aside from all of the nitty gritties around sick days and insurance and what's covered and what's not, someone was like, hello, it's also about groceries and childcare and paying their car insurance and the ripple, right? And
Yes.
We, as safety and health professionals, we talk about that all the time when we're talking about an injury that's sustained on the job, or someone who becomes, their lungs are impaired because of silicosis, right? Or COPD, and that the ripple continues, and it's irrelevant whether, so-and-so is going to pay for their, their basic medical care. It's all these other things they're added on top of that. And so just coming back to, again, sort of thinking about what is the messaging that we've got going on, what is the message that people need to hear, it's variable for each of them. But those are just a couple of things that have come up recently for me that have helped me think about, you know, we're way past people doing the right thing because it's altruistic, right?
Right.
Because we have so many people who perceive this to not be an issue still, that we've got to figure out different methods for communication around it.
Suggestions? No, Lisa had a good one. Messaging.
Yeah, to Hilarie's point, and I think it goes along with our general profession mantra, but how we go about helping our leadership understand, our folks in the field and people in general are really influenced by what we do, not by what we say. Not just within our own company, but companies all around. I've talked to some peer folks, and we all have, I think, some great and wonderful corporate messaging on what we need to do, how we need to do it. Limiting meetings, limiting folks that are in meetings at one time, or certain rooms, certain sizes, but there are various project teams, not necessarily just within our own company, but outside, that you can tell what's important to them by just watching them walk to lunch and sit in a booth or making sure they're spread out, at a larger table, or splitting up into two groups so that they're not all sitting close together, and that watching what they do in the office, are they diligent, or is it just the safety team that's wearing face coverings walking through the office? And in the field, people notice what we as leaders do, and
Yes.
they're walking around out there, or calling meetings, or going in and sitting underneath the break tent together with everybody. That waters down any messaging, meaningful messaging that's occurred. We can say what we want in the safety meetings, or in our foreman's meetings, or in our pod meetings, but it's really what we do that matters.
That is an incredibly important point, and it's not just COVID, is it? It's what
Right.
leadership does matters. Nicole, also, I just want to open this up to any things that are working for you that have changed since maybe the last time we talked.
Yeah, I mean, as far as what's working for us, I mean, I think it's just maintaining the emphasis, and really, continuing to talk about it, and especially where we have COVID fatigue, making a special point of reinforcing it with everybody, especially where we start seeing, some lax behaviors. I'd say that the field has been doing really well. I think that, the guys that are working out in the field they've gotten used to it. Depending, people are now finding the type of mask that they feel comfortable in. We may not have completely conquered the whole anti-fog safety glasses issue, but, I think it's becoming pretty routine. Where I think it's still challenging is in the indoor environment, which is where we actually need them the most. That is still really difficult for people to be holding meetings, and to be able to talk. And I know when I present and I have a mask on, I know it's difficult for people to hear me, and I try to talk as well as I can through that, but it's uncomfortable. And I think it also depends on, where you're living and those messages coming from the community. So, a lot of these people will, go back home after work, and they can go out to bars, restaurants, and not have to wear anything. So I think that is a confusing message, number one. Just the fact that they're saying on television, don't go have Thanksgiving. Well, that's confusing for people because they're thinking, well, I go out to dinner with my family a couple nights a week at the restaurants. Why can't I have Thanksgiving with them? So, it's obviously easier for us to manage those communications and to understand the point and why they're making those recommendations. But for people who aren't necessarily in it like we are and understanding the transmission, it's just very confusing for people. And then the last thing I would say is that, this pandemic is like every other safety challenge we have. It's easy to do when there's no other conflicting messages or pressures. Safety's easy. But as soon as you have, you're kind of in this position where now you have to make a challenging decision. I want to see my family for Thanksgiving. Then your perception of risk or your decisions changes based on what you really want to do. And that's the problem.
You mentioned something about ventilation, and it triggered the thought in my mind. As I've been following a lot of the conversations amongst epidemiologists on the issue of ventilation in the workplace, the schools, and we've had the CDC recommendations about opening windows and all that. Well, that's not going to work when it gets down to 30 degrees. But and I don't know, maybe Hilarie, you're the one to talk about this. There's also some talk about just using things like a box fan and putting a HEPA filter in that box fan. Can you offer any thoughts on that?
The ventilation issue is much more about increasing the amount of outside air, right?
Yes.
So that we've got dilution, and certainly Nicole can speak to this as well. When we don't increase the amount of outside air that we've got going in to dilute, and we just add in a box fan, whether it has a HEPA filter placed on it, or not, now you're creating a lot more turbulence, right, within that space. And so, we do want to be cautious about making those types of modifications. I mean, I think the most recent guidance that came out of Harvard's healthy building programs, and specifically looking at schools, is acknowledging that there's no way really in a school setting that you're going to be able to maintain 6 feet, and that their recommendation in schools is as long as people are wearing face coverings and you're improving ventilation as best you can, 3 feet is probably going to be more realistic. That's in a school setting, and what they're doing there with that recommendation is weighing the risk of not having kids in school, right? That we're losing kids, not only educationally, but they don't even know where, some of their kids are. They haven't presented back to school, and there's not enough, they're not sure where they're getting their meals from, et cetera, right? All of the costs of not having kids in school. So they're trying to really parse down the data and say, as long as certain control strategies are in place in that type of environment, then we could think about modifying the recommendation on distance. From the other ventilation perspective, we still don't know enough about viral load, to sort of, although we know that we do have super spreaders who, regardless of what it is that they're doing, they're just going to shed more virus than other people. And so again, if you're adding ventilation just in the form of movement into a space, then you're just spreading it around more. So, with that, comes looking at putting what is the cleaning protocol, right? And how many people are in a space at a given time. And if we're going to use a fan and put any type of filtration on it, are we also watching what we've got for outside air being provided, and where are we exhausting it to? It's a combination of all the things. It's that Swiss cheese model, right? That we see for all types of management of risk or safety related challenges that maybe we're all familiar of. And it's the same thing here. Every element, every intervention that we can do has holes in it, has gaps in it. But the more of those layers of intervention that we can put together, the less likelihood that those holes will line up and provide a direct pathway, through. So it is exhausting, and it's costly, and it's for those that don't believe, then it seems like overkill. But the reality is that it's sort of putting a variety of these things together. And my concern is definitely, as we move most people inside during the colder months. This was a conversation I had with our barbershop and beauty professional folks yesterday in our alliance meeting with them. And, that during the summer, a lot of the nail salons and, places where people get their haircut can have the doors open, right? And put a fan in and reduce occupancy. But as it gets colder, it's much more challenging to do that. And so we need to be thinking now, especially also on how we're going to maintain, sort of the humidity range that's being recommended now, which is also challenging in an environment like construction where you don't have HVAC systems up and running necessarily where people are going to be working. So that's where it becomes even more important to layer these different approaches together.
Well, is it possible that one of the long-term changes from this pandemic is that we think more about air changes per hour in our building construction going forward?
I would hope so. I don't know that it'll, what do you think, Nicole? You think that's where it'll go?
I think we struggle already just maintaining the current standards for air changes and proper air quality within our offices, and so I think it's going to be very challenging. And like we mentioned earlier, people have short memories. So once this is gone, I don't think it's going to be a priority for people's capital budgets to probably redo their ventilation systems.
Well, that's a whole nother subject for another podcast sometime, about the impact on public health with our airtight buildings without, reasonable air changes per hour. What else?
I guess I would add that in a way we feel like we are at the beginning of the pandemic again, with some of the discussions that we're having as far as, our working rotations or, remote working situations for people who can work remotely, where in some cases we've come back to work. Do we go out again? The impact on schools. I know my daughter went back to school one day and we were notified of close exposure, and she quarantined for the next 2 weeks. So that makes it very difficult on working parents who have just kind of gotten back into the swing of having their kids back into school. Sick time, I think, has got to be a major item to look at from an industry, or whether that's government or not. But, if we really look at some of the root causes, the fact that most contractors don't have sick time. So it doesn't matter what we tell them as far as don't come to work if you've been exposed, don't come to work if you're sick, they won't get paid. And so that's one of the most significant drivers to not being able to get a handle on this, is that, you can't expect people to stay home if it means they can't put food on the table.
That's a really good point, and it's not just the issue of sick time, although that's huge, but it's also part of the culture. As I remember working in the field, and if you called in sick, I mean, goodness, that was not going to be a bonus for your career, and you knew that. So we've got to change both that culture and then think about how do we make it possible for people to be sick and not get paid. Lisa, anything else?
I would agree on the kind of the sick days and that, and getting people to report. This is also the time of year that people start traveling home. And I mean home, maybe back out of the country, so to Mexico,
Mm-hmm.
in other parts, and getting folks to be honest about that. And again, quarantining, because at this point they're required to quarantine when they come back if you know that they've left.
Right.
And getting folks to be honest about that, figuring out how we can work with the employees. I mean, it's hard for everybody not being around your family, but not being around them, for an entire year or 2 or 3 years. It's a hard pull not to succumb to go back, and want to see them. So our challenge has been making sure our communication is clear, and the messaging that, hey, if you know somebody that's not feeling well, one, if you're not feeling well, please stay home. But if somebody shows up in your crew that's not feeling well, please let us know. The most frustrating thing is to think you've, communicated fairly well, and to get the late report of, well, somebody hadn't been feeling well for a couple of days and now they're home and they're going to get a COVID test and not have known anything about it. So, and that it is still not unusual, unfortunately. So it's just trying to maintain diligence for everybody. And it will be pretty interesting to see what happens over the next 3 to 4 weeks with the holiday travel and the holiday celebrations that are going on. For most people, it's one of their favorite times of year, including myself. And so it's hard to cancel these trips. And, I recently just canceled a trip to visit my best friends up in Chicago. And that's, I go up there every year, and, I just didn't feel good about going up there and then going home, so soon, or back to back. So with the risk of getting my parents sick. So, but just as much as we can as professionals, take the politics out of it and just kind of look at the science and help manage the communication and make sure it's clear to everybody, and over communicate. That's the best we can do, I think.
Any follow up on that, Hilarie or Nicole?
Yeah, it's hard. It's really hard right now. And I think that alone, we just have to also remember holidays are many people's very favorite time of year. And for others, holidays are the very hardest time of year, right? And we know that already. And we know people are moving into less daylight and colder temps, and seasonal depression is coming in. And we already know the construction industry is at higher risk, right, for mental health and suicide. I'm an optimistic person. You ladies know that about me, but this is, I'm scared. I'm concerned for what the next couple of months are going to look like, honestly. And we really, I think as we're talking about what we're communicating, it's not only communicating about how to drive down our risk and keep each other safe, but it's also highlighting looking out for each other and looking for other things that are going to be coming up for folks, because I think we are going to enter some darker times here. I'm with the numbers that I think will rise after this holiday span of travel. It's going to be painful for folks, and it's painful to either be witnessing or painful to experience. And so what are we doing to care for each other's mental health when we ourselves are so drained, right? You know, a lot of the safety and health professionals that I feel like when I talk to them about their workforces, and that they, you know, do they get their employees coming to them and sharing things with them that they wouldn't necessarily share with supervisors or other managers or even their HR department. You know, most every single person's hand will go up or they will nod yes. I, you know, somehow end up being treated like the therapist, right? The ad hoc therapist or somebody, you know, they're coming to me with a variety of different concerns. And so that means that's a burden or a weight that we feel in addition to all of the other components. And so I don't know if where we're at with that, if there's attention being drawn to that on any of y'all's sites, or is that an experience that you share? Is messaging about, you know, protecting mental health or looking out for signs or concerns something that's part of this conversation, this COVID conversation for you all?
Nicole?
Yeah, we definitely try. We've definitely raised the awareness around suicide in construction, mental health. We know that alcohol use, drug use, addiction, has gone up like 300% during this. So we know that it's out there, and we're trying to do as much as possible, but at the same time, these guys they're just getting hit with so much guidance, so much do this, don't do that. And at some point, too much messaging is just going to be lost. So we are really trying to be deliberate and keep those messages, direct and clear. And definitely mental health and suicide is definitely one of those messages.
Well, in closing, a couple of things. Yes, Hilarie's comment about safety people having folks come to them with life problems. When you have that going on, it means you are doing a great job, and it means you are leadership. You are showing leadership. There are plenty of safety people out there that no one in the crews is going to come to them with life problems. So those of you on this call are those people. And I know it's hard for you, but you are leaders. You are leaders in your industry and you're leaders in this pandemic. And I appreciate that very much. Appreciate you all. So I want to thank you guys. And hope everyone has a wonderful holiday, Thanksgiving. Stay safe out there and look forward to talking to you again.